ziua! Eu sunt Maria Martelis, sunt producătoare împreună cu colegii mei de la Sociologie a podcastului Contrasens și mă bucur să mă aflu aici în cadrul European Lab ca parte a unei invitații venite de la Fundația Transit și în colaborare cu Arti Party și voi modera acest panel propus de Caiet Jurnal. E un panel care încearcă să gândească chestiunea decolonizării în Europa de Est. Cred că o să încercăm să creionăm puțin câteva metode și practici culturale care să ne ajute în înțelegerea unei perspective post- sau decoloniale în Europa de Est și invitații prezenți aici sunt Dana Olărescu, e o artistă preocupată de justiție socială și ecofeminism,
interested in ecofeminism and social justice.
Preocupat de recuperarea identității est-europene și
she's interested in recovering
multe alte locuri.
a postmodern culture. Valer Simion Cosma, he's a historian working in Zalău. He's the founder of the Center for Rural Areas Research. And we also have a video intervention by Veda Popovici, who is a local activist interested in housing struggles and other sorts of struggles. She's also part of Macaz Association.
În stil mixt, așa cum cred că faptul că încercăm să fim decoloniali sau suntem decoloniali.
Trying to be decolonial, but at the same time, I think we'll mix languages. Valer will speak Romanian, and I think we can start with Veda Popovic's video, who will reply to the questions Caiet Jurnal asked.
Sound.
But I'm excited to nonetheless share my opinions on the topic.
Music is not part of the video.
So this is exciting. I think the topics are super important, so that's why I'm also so much more excited to answer them. I have received some questions, and I compiled some answers for them, and hopefully this can actually be a contribution to the conversation and not just like a isolated input. So, first question, why are we still speaking about Eastern Europe, and what does Eastern Europe mean? Well, first of all, Eastern Europe has not disappeared and has not been absorbed in Western Europe. It still serves as a repository for extraction, both material and human. So I would say Eastern Europe is still relevant as much as any subaltern political subject is. The meaning of Eastern Europe in a global matrix of power, in normative discourses and dynamics of power is, we know this very well, is that of a lesser Europe, an inferior version of Western Europe. It also means, of course, the ruins of what is considered in the neoliberal present, the failed experiment of socialism. Now, as critical anti-capitalist subjects of this region, I feel it's paramount for us to address this subaltern distribution, challenge it on both its local and global forms. Now, when thinking of the current political climate, specifically the new rise of fascism and how will this play out in the era of the climate crisis, producing, of course, not only new opportunities for capitalism to occupy and re-emerge, but also producing maybe openings for resistance. So let's say, in a nutshell, fascism in the era of the end of the world, Eastern Europe seems to me to have become a resource for furthering the right-wing utopia of a white Europe. Now, what I mean with this is, while people in Eastern Europe are tricked into not talking about the great financial disparity of the East and the West, or tricked into considering they deserve it, Western Europe, in its, of course, white supremacist version, can comfortably make use of the white passing characteristics of most Eastern Europeans to have menial labor done by immigrants that do not present much or any, for that matter, readable difference. In such a context, I think radical struggles fighting anti-Roma racism become crucial for understanding what Eastern Europe can do. Now, guided by such anti-racist principles, I believe Eastern Europe can still have a capacity to not only question and expose, but also refuse whiteness, understood, of course, as a category of the subject and not as colorism, and so intimately linked with capitalism, colonialism, and fascism. The second question, in your works, feminism and solidarity are powerful resources for political engagement. How do you understand their agency when it comes to dealing with issues such as internationalism, regionalism, or thinking of margins and peripheries? To answer this, in both my work as a political artist and as an organizer, locally, regionally, internationally, I use a decolonial lens, which mainly means positioning myself as a local agent in a global colonial matrix. It means that my analysis and my interventions are informed by an understanding of the position Eastern Europe has been distributed by global capitalism and acting from that knowledge. And that the pressures, of course, to be quote-unquote European, meaning, of course, capitalist and white, do not simply inform local developments on all levels of collective life, but are actually at the core of all of these aspects. They are at the core of political governments, culture, and the economy. Such an understanding of how Eurocentrism works for people here, then necessarily I feel it is tied with regional and international analysis. In my political work, mine and my collective's principles of solidarity, feminism, self-management, workers' rights, anti-racism are tied with regional and international understandings. And of course, growing concrete ties. As for my political art practice, I feel that art sometimes offers the territory for exploring ideas and connections, links and synchronicities with other regions or times that are still uncertain or unarticulated fully. So what art can do is it may offer the material expression of affects to some degree that make us political subjects like anger, frustration, alienation, and of course many other that are given identity tackles and channels, both time-wise and space-wise. That said, though, I also feel that currently such international ties are extremely weak. Social movements throughout the world are still judged according to Western standards, while non-Western activists need to work so much more to get their voices heard and their work recognized as relevant political praxis. The second.
Mi s-a părut foarte interesantă intervenția Vedei și
I think Veda's intervention was highly interesting, and I would like to refer to the fact that part of political practice is making concrete connections. And she says that what we do is judged from a colonial perspective nonetheless. And I would like to invite Valer to talk about the summer school in Belgium. Thank you very much for your invitation. As you very well said, I'm not a theoretician. On the subject of decolonialization, I am more practical, and when I talk about praxis, I talk about the Delciu Summer School. What I'm mostly interested in is the decentralization of research and culture. I think that rural areas is at the periphery, from a double perspective, culturally speaking, for instance, and globally speaking. The idea of holding a summer school in a village in Belgium is related, as I was saying in the break, to the decolonization of the academia rather than Romania, because the impact of the summer school, as well as other undergoings that I'm involved in, is quite marginal. However, we can see an impact of the
celor
summer
care vin,
school,
studenți, cercetători,
among those who
activiști,
come
care vin
there,
și petrec o perioadă
activists
acolo.
or researchers or students.
Pentru că
They come and
comunitatea are
spend some
cumva
time in
ritmul ei,
Belgium.
este foarte greu
The rural
să
community
o
has its own
racordezi la astfel de
pace, its
inițiative
own
și pe de altă
rhythm.
parte, dacă este să discutăm
That's why it's very
onest, o
difficult
astfel de
to
inițiativă are
involve it
ea
in
însăși
such an
o
initiative.
dimensiune
And on the
colonială,
other
pentru
hand,
că
such an
noi ne
initiative
ducem
has a
într-o comunitate
colonial
rurală
dimension
și
as well, because we
propunem niște
simply go
subiecte,
to a
discutăm,
rural
cum s-ar
community
zice,
and set
le
forward
explicăm celor de acolo cum
certain
stă treaba.
topics. We
Ceea ce noi
lecture
nu
people, so to
Nu
speak.
facem
But you don't do that.
doar asta, dar e și
Well, we
asta,
don't
dacă
just
este
do
să
that,
asumăm
but
o
we also do that.
notă autocritică. Desigur, nu facem doar asta și sunt
Of course, that's
activități acolo
not
care
all we
caută să
do, and there are
implice
activities in the
comunitatea
Turkish
locală.
summer school
Unde
that
nu se
aim at
implică e
involving
partea
the
academică,
local
adică noi
community.
organizăm
But there
acolo
is also
cursuri,
an
sunt
academic
profesori,
part.
cercetători, activiști din toată
So we
lumea
have
invitați
researchers,
în fiecare
activists from
an,
the whole
care
world. We
țin timp de
invite them
săptămână cursuri pentru
to
participanți.
hold
În
lectures,
comunitate
to
nu
hold
participă nimeni
workshops.
la asta și
But
într-un
no
fel
one in
e
the community
de
comes to
înțeles,
these
oamenii au alte
courses,
probleme, alte
which is
priorități.
quite
Chiar dacă
understandable
noi,
because
când
people have
alegem
other
tematica și
priorities.
cursurile,
We
căutăm
do
să
think
fie
of the community
probleme
when we
relevante pentru
choose our
comunitatea
topics
locală
because we want
și pentru comunitățile
to
rurale
tackle
sau
relevant
periferice în general.
issues.
Partea unde comunitatea se implică și participă
Where the
e mai mult
community gets involved
partea de spectacole de teatru,
is
proiecții
the entertainment
de filme
bit,
în aer
like
liber
film
sau atelierele care
screenings
sunt
or
adresate
workshops
elevilor, adolescenților din
that are
localitate.
targeted at the
Tocmai de aia,
students or
pentru că
pupils
mie mi se pare
in the
foarte
village.
important această
And I think
dimensiune.
this aspect is
Am
very
extins
relevant.
atelierele de la
That is
prima
why we
ediție,
multiplied
care
our
erau concentrate
workshops
doar
from
într-o
our first
săptămână.
edition.
Anul
They only
trecut
lasted for one
vorbim
week,
de
but starting
ateliere care
last year,
durează,
we have
se întind pe parcursul a
workshops
2 luni, durând câte
that
2-3
last for
săptămâni.
2
Sunt mai multe
months
ateliere
to 2 or 3
gratuite.
weeks,
Și pe lângă
throughout
asta
2
am lansat
months.
și un program de rezidență,
Apart from
de
that, we also have a residency
creație și
program
de cercetare și creație
for
artistică.
artistic
Pentru că,
research and
de regulă, lumea
creation.
rurală și urbană
Why?
mic
Because
e
generally,
văzut ca
rural
un
areas
consumator de cultură, de ce
are
se produce
considered
în
as
altă parte, în marile centre
art
de
consumers,
cultură.
consumers of
Ruralul, evident,
art
este redus
produced
la
somewhere
producția de
else.
folclor și tot ceea ce înseamnă
But rural areas are
festivismul
usually associated
etnografic.
with
Și cumva ne-am
folklore
gândit
and
să invităm
folk
artiști
art.
care să stea o perioadă,
So we
o
thought
lună,
about
două, să
inviting
stea în Telciu sau în
artists
localitățile
to
vecine
Telciu
și în
or
funcție de
to neighboring areas, neighboring villages.
domeniul lor de activitate, teatru, film documentar, benzi desenate, literatură
And
sau altceva,
depending on
să
what
elaboreze
area they work in,
un produs
we
cultural,
invite them
să
to
folosesc termenul ăsta,
develop,
dar cumva
so to speak,
în interacțiune
an
cu
artistic
cei din
product.
sat. Mă refer în special cu tineri.
but in order to
Și cu
produce
adulții,
this,
în
to
măsura în care
interact
există
with the
interes și
children
disponibilitate din
and
partea
the
lor,
adults in
cumva
the
făcând să
villages.
fie cât mai puțin
If, of course, they're
intruzivi.
interested.
Și asta mi se
We
pare
don't want to be
cumva,
very intrusive.
să zic, o parte mai importantă, faptul că
What is
reușim
also
într-o formă
very
modestă,
important,
dar reușim să
we
producem
managed
în
to,
ultimii ani, nu știu, un spectacol de teatru, un film documentar, pe care după
We managed to
aia
produce
le
documentary
reducem în
films, for instance,
orașe,
or
plus
theatre
București,
plays,
Catania,
which then get to travel all throughout Romania. We try to reverse this trend. So the village, this time around, goes to the city with something it has produced. We usually have urban artists who come to our villages and produce something there with the local community. What kind of theatre? Documentary theatre. Last year we had a show about the first jobs of teenagers. We had a play. And we also drew up a comic book called People and Jobs, Endangered People and Jobs. That is very interesting. Could you tell everyone something you told me during the break, namely that the true interaction takes place outside the academia? Because usually this academic space does not necessarily include everyone, because not everyone feels at ease in such a space. Yes, that's one aspect, and on the other hand, people are very happy that other people from urban areas come and talk about things, but on the other hand, these people in the villages are not interested in what we're talking about. But what is interesting is that when people have a beer together, for instance, in the evening, They interact with the speakers, with the participants in our summer school. And sometimes some of the lessons of the lectures are reproduced over a beer in the evening. We even wanted to organize classes in pubs. We wanted to encourage people to participate. The result was interesting, but rather anecdotal, because the lecture wasn't a lecture per se, because the speaker was bombarded with questions and he was also ridiculed. But in a sense, it was interesting. It was an interesting experiment. People in the village could not understand why others come to explain things to them. Yes, you have to understand this idea, first of all. I think this double learning process is very interesting. The people who come to Belgium have a lot of things to learn from the villagers. And they can also understand that world much better and get rid of prejudice or of certain cliches, whether they idealize or demonize this village world. At the same time, young people from the village have the opportunity to learn new things, to discover new things. And what is also important is this inferiority complex that many people in rural areas have, whether young or old. They feel they are inferior to people living in urban areas, and they feel they are inferior to people who are educated. So by spending time together, this can shift. But of course, the attitude of our guests, of our lecturers, is very important as well. But the relationship between the lecturers and the villagers gets more humane. Yes, I think that's really good. And I think learning should go both ways, because if only one side keeps learning, there is this inequality in power. But if you come to think about it, many people living in cities don't know so many aspects about village life. I know that you too participate in some kind of summer school.
I'm just going to
Yes, of course.
I think it comes back to the idea of what Veda was saying earlier about experiencing this discourse of a lesser Europe, and I have experienced it in the West as a Romanian living in the West. So I think for me, I actually think in those derogatory terms, and to express it in Romanian, it's actually very weird for me. So my experience with a particular summer school, it's called Holis, and it's founded by two of my friends. They're Hungarian, and it's basically a summer school based on interdisciplinary collaboration that's always centered in a rural area in Eastern Europe. Every year they move to a different country, although in the last 3 years I think they've tried to bring it back to one base, so they're running different stages of the camp every year. And what it does is it brings students from all over the world, students and non-students, to work in design. They kind of use design thinking to meet the community, figure out who the community is, what their needs are, what they like about the space, what they dislike about the space, and hopefully after 10 days perhaps come up with a couple of solutions of improving their day-to-day lives.
Which is really a short time.
Which is obviously really, really short. But actually what it does, I mean, I don't think anyone starts from the idea that we're going to make great progress with this or we're going to come up with incredible solutions, because it's not about that. It's about community, and it's actually about the decolonization of the mind in many ways, because all of these people who come together, so we have facilitators, so I'm one of the facilitators, and we have students, but actually the hierarchy doesn't really exist. So what we do is we learn from each other in these 10 days. We live together in the same house, we cook together. Everything is very intense, because it's 24 hours that we spend together with ourselves and with the other community. And it actually starts from the idea, this is the idea of the founder, that health in terms of well-being actually starts from the soil, which means that we all eat very good food, that we cook together with some of the local women. And so we're very interested in kind of rediscovering native Eastern European recipes, which obviously come with Eastern European cultural heritage, and basically that's what the camp is centered on. And it's also this idea that everything in terms of knowledge that we've experienced as knowledge is experienced by sitting down. And we're really interested in this corporeality of knowledge, in which we kind of roll on the grass and we do a lot of observational walks, and we talk to people by running or by doing anything else, anything that you don't know. And obviously it's very scary at the beginning, because as much as we think we're liberal and we'll know, we have no idea, because that's very much how everyone experiences knowledge, from a very academic point of view. And then we just try to get rid of that. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, it's difficult. What I found it nice, I remembered when you were saying about eating together, and I think this is a really good way to communicate and learn and do everything. I recently read that, well, I don't remember where, but there are peoples that consider family who you eat from the same land. So if you eat from the same land, the same food, that's family.
Exactly. And also this idea that, I mean, we were talking to some of the people in the village who said, oh, you know, because everyone comes from different countries, and not only they come from different countries, but they also live in other countries. So there's like a duality there already. So it's sort of crazy what's happening. But they said, oh, okay, so you're telling us about these Western practices that you do. So for example, you're planting the seeds and you just let it grow, and you don't speak to the seed, and you don't dance around the seed, and you don't do any sort of rituals. And most people said, no, we don't. And they say, and then you wonder why you're unhealthy. And that's sort of, again, like going back to this idea of indigenous knowledge and what knowledge really is, you know, that always comes at the expense of science being the official knowledge and the only knowledge.
Vreau să mai adaug ceva, că am realizat că am uitat să spun esențialul. Legat de școala asta de vară,
Related to this
când am
summer
pornit școala de
schooling
vară,
Telciu,
m-am
when we
uitat la proiecte
started
asemănătoare,
out,
în
you looked
special la
at
cele care
other
asumă
similar projects,
o poziție
especially those that
decolonială
have
sau
a
o poziție de
decolonializing
stânga. Și am
position or a
constatat în foarte multe
leftist
cazuri
position,
problema
and I
accesului.
realized
Cumva
that
sunt capturate
that
foarte
there is
multe
this
de o
lack of
logică neoliberală
access.
capitalistă. În ce sens? Se fac chestii foarte interesante cu
There are so many
foarte
interesting
buni,
things
dar foarte
and so
scumpe,
many interesting
inaccesibile.
speakers, but
Și
they are
asta a fost una
inaccessible
dintre
because they are
chestiile
too
care m-au revoltat. De
expensive.
exemplu,
This
eu n-am fost la nicio școală de
got
vară,
me
pentru
up
că
in
mi-am
arms.
permis
I couldn't go to any summer school because I couldn't afford it. The prices are just too high. So when we organized our summer school in Telciu, we wanted to make it as accessible as possible. Our fee is of 100 lei, which is just a few tens of euros. 50 euros for people coming from countries whose income are of over 500 euros. So we managed to differentiate between these fees. There are other people who wanted to come and who couldn't afford the fee, but they were welcome anyway. We also tried to maintain a high quality of the content as well. I'm talking about the shows or the plays or our guests. If we are happy about something, that's the fact that we managed to organize a summer school that can compare to Western schools, but at the same time a more accessible such event. We do want to change things in this world, but who can afford to go and participate? Either the very healthy or the very bright. But if you're not an excellent student and you don't have a grant, for instance, or you don't have the money, you simply cannot participate in this sort of events. So everyone should have access. Of course, when I talk about average people, the average people, I talk about the ordinary people. This is also an indirect critic to similar projects. Of course, when you have money, you have access to change. You can be the change yourself. If you don't have the money, you have to linger in the periphery. Yes, that's a very important aspect, I believe, and it's very good that you mentioned it.
continui și toate chestia astea cu...
Yes, we talk about content and what is cool and what is extraordinary, and we leave aside this very important aspect, which is access to the events. What is also important at the Telgiu Summer School is that it happens every year, it takes place every year in the same place. Yes, and we have over 100 guests from all around the world. Now we have limited seats because we don't want to become a festival and trouble the rhythm of the community. People like our event, but we don't want to take over the whole community because it will get out of hands. What we want is for people to come if they are interested. We don't want to attract people who are interested in entertainment because this event takes place in a very nice and rustic environment.
Maybe we can continue with the second part of the Veda's intervention.
Question. The second to the second, so it's second question B. Can we speak of a decolonial thinking in Eastern Europe? If so, in what terms? In short, absolutely. I think Eastern Europe has a century-old history of being cast as a lesser Europe, as a territory for experimentation, or, of course, Orientalist exploration, or in a newer Cold War paradigm as a backward, out-of-sync black hole. And this has not really stopped. In fact, throughout history, we can see that a very similar pattern of Eastern Europe being consistently cast as a subaltern, yet not included in formal analysis of subaltern subjectivities, prevails. Today, aspirational politics, and by that I mean an imperative embedded in political practices to aspire to be European. So these aspirational politics determine almost all of governmental decisions and a great deal of social movements too, sadly. To this day, anyone claiming Europeanness in the Eastern European context, so anyone claiming Europeanness as a value in an affirmative way, is either a neoliberal subject, a bourgeois nostalgic, or a fascist, or even all three, which is, of course, the worst. To refuse Europeanness in its white capitalist, neo-colonial normative form is imperative, I think, to a critical regional subject. And to articulate such a refusal without igniting nationalist, right-wing ideologies, so to articulate it from a radical left perspective can only be done, I believe, through decolonial thought. But of course, decolonial thought put together with anti-capitalist analysis, radical feminism, and so on. Additionally, I feel there is also, to be explored, there is the point of anti-communism. And so what I mean is today we can clearly see such a strong comeback of anti-communist rhetorics with neo-fascist groups in the Western world. As opposed to popular belief, anti-communism has known its most resounding victory not during the Cold War, but actually after its end, when societies in Eastern Europe were convinced of their backwardness and need for quote-unquote education through a new capitalist enclosure. So the efficiency of the discourse, I believe, was guaranteed by its synergy with an Orientalist colonial distribution of the region as a backward province. Thus, critical decolonial thinking in Eastern Europe can actually support us to fight also the discourse of anti-communism, both locally and globally. Next question. In our view, Romania and Eastern Europe share a historical experience, a common course of dissent, working as a nexus of ideas and cultural practices that trigger resistance within a post-socialist context. How can we use this potential to redefine the current meaning of Europe? Good question. I honestly believe that we need to renounce altogether the idea of Europe. I often find myself really wondering, why are people so keen to recuperate and redefine the idea of Europe? Why this desire? How can any so-called liberatory understanding of Europe then not feed narratives of the EU or the United Nations or the IMF? And this is not, I believe this is a crucial question. So then, if invoking the idea of Europe affirmatively is always done through either a neoliberal, bourgeois, or fascist lens, and has been done so for centuries, why should anyone expect the non-Western immigrant, construction worker, or caretaker to be convinced of a beneficial Europe? So with this question, I'm actually addressing the discursive, subjective, and material territories on which the idea of Europe is debated. And at this we need to look really closely. Can they actually be territories of decolonial, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal engagement? Now, the Romanian context actually offers a history of over 100 years of debates on what is Europe, do we belong to that Europe, and most important of all, how to prove such belonging. I argue that the opportunity lays precisely in the debate, and the next historical stage of that debate needs to be a decolonial one in which the experiences of subjectivation, discourse developments, and material dependencies from both Eastern Europe and other semi-peripheries and peripheries of the world can say something on the lines of, we don't need the idea of Europe. It is founded on capitalist, colonial, and white supremacist ideals. Its foundation is rotten. And then the last question, what type of thinking and practices do you think are needed to reimagine the future of Europe and Eastern Europe? Is there new thinking possible beyond the end of history or, quote, after the end of post-communism? Eastern Europe, I believe, offers a variety of practices and thought that can challenge not only Eurocentrism, but also categories of patriarchal, heteronormative, and racist organizing of the world. Without falling into some local fetishism, I truly believe that social movements can weave resistance onto broader local and regional social mentalities, such as the distrust with the state, the knowledge of getting by, including getting by the law, practices of collective mutual aid, and of course the experience of believing that another non-capitalist world is possible. As to the latter point, I really think that it is crucial to address issues of imagination, which I also do through my art practice. To outlive capitalism and also survive the climate crisis, we must imagine it first. And I believe that such narratives coming from both socialist times and post-socialist present are extremely valuable. Undigging stories of anti-capitalist and anti-fascist resistance that are concrete to some degree, but also looking at speculative fictions are not only ways to dignify local regional subjects, but also to build true international ties, I think. So, this was my input. Hope it kind of becomes part of the conversation. Thank you again.
So I think Veda's commentaries were really incisive and really sharp, and we could start to pick some threads from what she was saying, and there are at least 3 paths to go towards, but I would maybe start with how does the idea of Europe work for us? How do we think it? And how does it think us? And in that sense, Dana, maybe you can tell us about your projects.
Yeah, of course. Is it possible to get thank you. So I'm a Romanian artist who's been living in the UK for 10 years. And so the projects that I'm going to show you reflect that reality of what it actually means to be an Eastern European in the West. So in 2011, I think, I met Bojana on the right side of the image. She's Serbian. We both moved to London we both have a theatre practice in our background, and we both moved to London to do that. But we actually discovered in the first few months that all we were going to do was actually talk about what we were going through as immigrants in London. And so we decided to fund a company called They're There, which would actually counter the divisive and sectarian media discourse, but also governmental discourse that's been plastered for the last 15 years, pretty much since Poland joined the EU. against Eastern European migrants. So we thought we can actually reclaim Eastern European identity. If we are Eastern European in the UK, we probably have to have a voice and explain what our viewpoint is, rather than allow people to tell us who we are and what Eastern Europe is, because some people actually think that Eastern European is actually a language, that we're all part of the same country. And I have had that conversation with a few people. I mean, it's dispiriting, but it's what people think. So we decided, one, to reclaim Eastern Europeanness through a series of performances and installations. Two, to actually involve Eastern European communities in this conversation and make sure that we actually give them a platform, because it's not enough for artists to claim the space. We were really, really interested in what people had to say, people of, from any sort of background who didn't necessarily have to be connected to the arts at all, and also give practical advice on very serious matters that we all had to go through, such as bureaucratic forms and work permits that would change every year, and then you'd get another one, and then the other one is fake, and so on and so forth, or it doesn't exist anymore. One of my friends actually applied for a blue card, which is just like a work permit, and got rejected, and then a year later he received one in the post that wasn't his. So these things happen all the time, and we thought, okay, how can we address these issues? And the third thing we really wanted to talk about was that in arts institutions, particularly important arts institutions, that would be museums, theaters, galleries, you name it, they don't think of Eastern Europeans as a demographic, as a valid demographic. And we thought, well, if you think there's so many of us who are spoiling this country and who are here to steal jobs, why can't you consider us as a valid audience or visitors? And why, one, can't we be represented in these institutions, and two, make space for the audiences, for these audiences to actually feel welcome. So the way we did that, this is a theater show we did, but this is just the poster for it. I don't think you can see it, but just above the door, the sign actually says Job Center. So that's just us stealing jobs from the Job Center, because obviously that's what we've always been told we do. Romanians don't come to take jobs, they come to steal jobs. And this was just one of the stereotypes that we decided to tackle. So the way we do it is we basically do a bunch of like performances or participatory art projects in which we invite audiences in and we actually dissect these stereotypes. So one of them, in 2014, Croatia joined the EU, which meant that they suddenly had to go through all of the rigmarole that we'd been through as Romanians, so like different work permits. So we thought actually the only thing that we can do as artists is record an album of advice for them. So we did that, and we decided to disseminate it into the streets, to give it to people who didn't know, to give it to English people so that they could actually understand what migrants have to go through. And we actually did that by wearing politicians' masks. And at the time, it was David Cameron and Nigel Farage. You can probably see it on the bottom right corner. I mean, Nigel Farage is still going after so many years. But it was very important for us to actually walk into the streets, make sure that we just give a set of headphones to people, they listen to the album, and we can't say anything. And that allows people to actually tell us whatever it is that they have on their mind. And most of them would actually completely understand that we are not the politicians. You know, mostly we would be wearing cleaners' costumes, and we thought it would be very relevant for these two to be cleaners and understand what this reality is. And people would say, I understand you're not David Cameron, but I'm going to tell you what I think about you. And this actually revolved into like a series of performances because we didn't quite expect people to have this really visceral reactions towards what was happening, whether they were migrants or not. So that's how we came up with the idea of putting these people into the same room so that they could actually have a conversation, because mostly, you know, there's only so many times you can tell someone they're shit for them to believe they are. And there's only so many times you can tell someone that a certain demographic can be the scapegoat for them to actually believe that that's true. So the next project we did is called Trigger Warning. So it's just a set of games which literally takes quintessential English games that you'd find in any fair. This game, for example, is called Hook a Duck. You normally just go and hook a duck. But we decided to call it Hook a Job, and to put the jobs that Eastern Europeans normally get on the back of the ducks. So we have these games that look kind of colorful and fun, and we invite people in, and then they come in and they think it's going to be really funny, and then they discover it's really not. And that's when the conversation really takes place. And we've seen parents try to describe Brexit to their children, to their 5-year-olds who think it's really fun to pick a duck, and then see immigrant officer on the back and actually ask their mother or their father, what that means, and they actually had to be in the position to explain. Another game, oh, sorry, one sec. I'll go back to that. Another game is passport in a bucket. So you'd have to, so we'd get like a passport that we put in a teapot, and you'd have to throw as many tea bags, five consecutive tea bags into a teapot so as to get a British passport. Obviously, no one can ever do that. And it was literally the only way the British people could see this is sort of impossible. You know, the citizenship game, the game that we all have to go through, and the role that we have to perform in society to become, you know, whoever they want us to become. Another game, it was called the Wheel of Fortune, which to us was the Wheel of Benefits. So again, you'd spin the wheel and see all the ridiculous things that you would get, such as, what was it? Free TV license or mice traps or stuff like that, because all the houses are filled with mice, turns out in the UK. And then another one, which was everyone's favorite, we just printed a banner, and it's on the top right corner, and the banner said, "Wish you were here," and it just presented the photo of a patient in bed in a hospital and the doctor next to the patient. But it actually shows the patient having a brilliant time. It's almost like they're going to the seaside and they're having a cocktail and they're having the best food, because that's what Eastern Europeans go and do. They abuse the NHS and like the private medical services. So that's literally what we do. We just took all the stereotypes and we kind of threw them in everyone's faces. And we decided to invite Eastern Europeans to engage people into the games. Eastern Europeans of all backgrounds, most of them mixed race as well. It was really, really interesting. To actually have these conversations with people. And we asked them to wear tags of a stereotype they've been told, they've kind of been told about. And someone had, I can't remember what it was, something like, positive voice. I think it was positive voice. And then people would come and say, "Oh my God, please tell me something about positive voice." And then she would start telling them everything, you know. So I think this is sort of how we work. We like to subvert things, and I'll basically just show you a quick video because I think it's easier like that.
Strawberry picker.
Strawberry picker.
Quite good, right? Public toilet cleaner. They're usually quite terrified that they
The right moment.
They got that, and then they feel like public toilet cleaner, which is usually the previous one, is much better. I had one who was quite happy with bug exterminator. He said at least that's a public service.
I want a British passport, and I think he wants the Romanian one.
Maybe a British passport to stay here.
Christmas bonus.
If it's buffering, it's fine. Don't worry. It's okay.
No.
It's rigged.
It is?
It's rigged.
It's fine, we can just skip. This is from the camp that I mentioned earlier, Hollis, so this is just us working collaboratively. And then, so actually this year, Boyana and I decided to stop there because after so many years, we've sort of had enough about talking about Eastern European identity, in that sense of you have to constantly ask yourselves questions. Every single time it feels like you're justifying yourself, particularly with arts institutions who, you know, over the years actually became more understanding of our needs and what we actually wanted to do.
I did wanted to ask you why you stopped, but I thought it was like a dangerous question. I hope it's not sad for you.
No, not at all. No, we just decided to do it, and also I think after so many years of doing this, you also want to develop in different ways, and obviously working with communities is very much linked to work. I mean, I have started working with low-income communities, not just Eastern European ones. And to me, it's all about connecting the dots between marginalization and climate change as well. So right now, for example, I'm working on a project with a community in an area in London that's incredibly gentrified. And so as a result, all of the low-income communities are being pushed aside violently. And so me and a social designer are working with a community hub to actually build a mini house that's only made of natural materials and recyclable materials with the community. We want to pay them to do it with us so that we all get skills by working together. with the effect of growing microgreens and sprouts inside. And obviously this is also our commentary on food scarcity and the really poor quality of food in the UK and the very poor access to food, to good quality food by low-income people. And we sort of couple this once it's built. We're going to do a series of art workshops that are related to sustainability and decolonial thinking and understanding, like allowing people to come in and ask us all the questions they want to do and making sure that, greening the world doesn't become a middle-class project either.
Great. I think I really like this. When I checked your project, I found it really nice and inspiring, and I think it ties nicely with what Veda said, that we have a bit of maybe a lack of imagination in many ways. It is difficult to imagine how the world could look like in a better way from the way it looks like now and from the way it is predicted to look, especially from from the climate side. So your project, I think, really ties into that. And I did wonder though, why did you choose microgreens?
Because they are incredibly nutritious, and they're actually about, I can't remember the statistics exactly, but about 20% more nutritious than the mature plants, and sprouts as well. So actually what we want to do is teach people to grow them because they're very easy to grow. So anyone can grow them on their window. So it takes, sprouts take a couple of days, microgreens take a week. So it's very, very easy. So we just actually centered on something that would be super beneficial to the local community.
Because my vague idea regarding microgreens is that it's very expensive and a very bourgeois hipster thing.
It is, and that's basically why we want to do it, because it's only used by Michelin restaurants, and it's incredibly expensive. And also, once you cut them, because you have to harvest really quickly, they go off in about a day. So normally people take them for far distances, and what we want to do is ensure that these things that are normally incredibly expensive and only accessible to people with a certain amount of money are accessible to everyone, because this is what nature is, and that's what nature actually does.
Yeah. Mă gândeam să scriu, Valer, mă gândeam că toate lucrurile care le-a zis Dana îs cumva
Everything that Dana has said are very well expressed, especially this last idea, and the way you can tie community to the space it lives in, and what you need, all the resources you need in order to survive. And I wanted to make a connection with the school in Delciu, the summer school in Delciu. Well, in fact, we don't live in Delciu, so there is a huge difference in this respect. I do come from a village, my family is born there, and I do have a connection to my family, but apart from the summer, when we have our residences or our summer school, we have a limited interaction with the community in the village. So there's another kind of relationship there. On the one hand, I think it's fine that way, although personally I cannot not see that, generally speaking, especially in the left part of the political spectrum, there is a difference. There are inconsistencies between theory and practice. On the one hand, and Veda said this really well, that we have a complex, there is this need to be validated in the prestigious centers. We need to validate our work there, whether we go to the centers or we receive them here. I can see this in my work as well. From one point onwards, you can no longer control this dynamic. And on the other hand, there is this mission for change. We take it on. Many of us do, but at the same time, we don't have the capacity to move away from large university centers such as Bucharest, Cluj, London, or others. So these areas have myriads of small initiatives, but the real periphery, the rural areas, the small towns, still lack such initiatives. Yes, we do go there temporarily or we study there, but apart from that, that's it. So if we speak of real change, we should bridge the gap, because moving away from the large centers and moving to the periphery, to the margins, to understand the margins before you want to change them is essential. I no longer live here in Cluj. I live in a smaller town in Zalău, and I can feel all these issues more acutely than when I lived in Cluj. I was caught up in this dynamic, in this Cluj dynamic before, but then I moved to a smaller town and I realized that there are inconsistencies and disparities. And now I wonder, why do people live in such large cities? Apart from the job issue, some people could work remotely from smaller towns. But in fact, it's this lifestyle that you cannot have access to in smaller towns. And more often than not, activism is a sort of sustaining, is a means of sustaining this lifestyle. Of course, it's also linked to this precariat lifestyle. I'm now employed, state employed, so I'm no longer part of this category. But you do have to scrape a living, and then you have to put your theory aside and try to actually make a living. If you live in Cluj, then you will realize that everything is expensive. So in order to sustain this way of living, this expensive way of living, you have to work all sorts of things, to have odd jobs or whatnot. So actually going and living in these smaller communities is one solution. And on the other hand, there is the issue of access to public institutions, because you cannot bring about real change unless you have access to public institution networks. We may have a lot of activities with NGOs and may have a lot of workshops, but without access to public institutions, you cannot bring about real change. So people who have the ambition of changing things should try to enter these public networks, public institution networks, even in smaller towns. Because many times you realize that there are such institutions, even in small areas. There are even material resources and financial resources, but people just don't tap into them. Yes, that's a very good point. There are, of course, certain important and large centers, and Romania, Cluj is one of them. And this idea of moving away from these large centers would be a good point. And again, tapping into the resources of public institutions is another valid point. It's more difficult to take over institutions. Well, you don't have to take over the institutions, you can just join them. Yes, that's right. So it's more difficult to change the system, the institution, right? Yes, you can just bring new ideas, a breath of fresh air into an institution. And there are such institutions in many small towns, and I can tell you from my own experience, even in Bistrița and Zalău, there are such centers and public institutions. Well, leaving corruption or cronyism aside, there is opportunity for people coming up with new ideas. And what I find very sad is the fact that we are bombarded, and especially young people, bombarded by this idea that you have to move to a large city. And if you live in a smaller city, you are a failure. There is this idea that no big shot would go back to a smaller town. Our colleague here worked with teenagers in Zalău, and we had an exercise discussed with our young people there. So we asked them how many wanted to come back after finishing their studies. None of them wanted to go back to Zalău, to their hometown. They simply asked themselves, what can I do if I come back here? Because small towns like Zalău, the one I was mentioning, so these towns are the ones that people usually leave. Yes, very well pinpointed. Thank you. Kaya Journal asked us to rethink Eastern Europe and see how we can decentralize things, which is highly complicated, but I do believe that we managed to outline a few ideas and a few tools that we can use in the future. Are there any questions in the room for any of the speakers or related to any topic that we talked about? Well, in fact, this is the first time I've heard about your work, Dana, and I find it extraordinary. I am acquainted with what Valer is doing. I wanted to ask Valer something. Could you talk about this shift? So the first editions were of the summer school revolved around decolonialization, and then you talked about dystopias of work. So why this shift in the subjects you tackled within the summer school? Well, there was a shift because during the first editions of the summer school, we delved deeply into the theory of decolonialization, especially related to rural areas. But I think that the economic dimension is vital if we want to understand the situation. As I was trying to say earlier, we are captive to a socio-economic system that influence our activities in general. And there is this economic system that we have to analyze from a decolonializing perspective as well. That's why we had this shift. Plus, we managed to have very important economists, left-wing economists, join us. And they managed to bring valuable ideas. I hope I managed to answer your question. Moreover, there is this idea of being constantly in connection with irrelevant topics. That's why this year we picked racism and the idea of sovereignty, sovereignties, as we call them, because there are several approaches, right-wing, left-wing. We realized that sovereignty is completely taken over by the right, so we wanted to bring it to a leftist perspective and talk about the sovereignty of local communities, food sovereignty, and so on. I think such a topic should not be left to either one side. Just one more comment. I just wanted to provoke a little when I asked about the economy. I was part of the residence together with Alexandra Bovizianu. And indeed, talking to people about the economic catastrophe we're going through, was quite easy because, in fact, everyone could relate to this topic. Se gândește foarte mult la clasă, știi? Acum, mă rog, nu știu dacă e neapărat fantezia noastră ca școală să fie neapărat decolonială, adică și atâta să vorbească numai despre chestia asta. Yes, of course, we cannot only talk about decolonialization within the Tokyo Summer School, but I think this economic bit that I mentioned should be there. Because it is a common language that everyone can understand. And speaking of Cornel Ban, he is part of the team. He's a well-known macroeconomist, and he was mentioning some sort of forms that you have to fill out concerning taxes. But statistics show that many left-wing peoples are actually agree with some right-wing ideas.
To some extent, all the conversations we had with the local community, with the guests, all we talked about somehow got to the idea of money. Why do people leave the village? Very true, as a village is actually a very prosperous village. It has the largest forest area in the country, and you see that people live above average. But money are not made there in Delciu. Most people work abroad, they're seasonal workers, and send their money back to Romania. At the same time, local resources are being exploited and money goes somewhere else. This is something horrible. There are no working places. You can get a job in the forest industry, but not in processing. So it's very cynical to see a prosperous community that is based on work being done abroad and seeing your resources leave your community. So it was relevant for us to also deal with this issue of the economics.
Alors, en français, merci beaucoup pour les idées que vous avez développées là maintenant.
Thank you for the way you approach this subject, this topic. I have a question. How do you manage to connect the topic of decolonialism? Thank you for the ideas. I didn't understand quite right what is the connection between decolonialism and the rural village in Romania. I do not understand the connection. Do you mean the school? Do you mean the summer school? As I was saying at the very beginning, we started with the idea of periphery on two levels, the village compared to the city, and then Romania in connection to Europe. We are at the periphery. And then we can also take a look at this situation I was mentioning, extractive economy. The community, the village is to some extent exploited, and the village is seen as a space where you extract resources, be they material resources or human resources. It is not being seen as a place where you would want to spend your life. This becomes obvious from the approach of the Romanian institutions towards and the attitude towards big capital. This is why we wanted to go there and find a connection to decolonialism. We wanted to produce knowledge and to have access to other types of knowledge, vernacular knowledge, which is very different than what you can find in libraries. Of course, we spent some time there. Some of the colleagues involved in the project are to some extent involved as researchers in researching rural area. As was mentioned, we also have an institute for researching rural area, the rural area. I'm an anthropologist. I'm a historian, not an anthropologist, but however, we wanted to set up such an institution in in the rural area. This is somehow in the same line with decolonial thinking. I think that these debates, be they restricted, limited or not to the academia, are very important, and we should have these conversations in rural areas as well. It's not about going to the village and spending your holiday there. No, it's about using the infrastructure, but also getting in touch with the community, trying to set up a basis for an exchange and dialogue. I think changing the rural world, this is not what we should be focused on. Understanding it is more important, and that decolonial thinking is rather perceived in the decolonial academia. I think this is very relevant because beyond, apart from reading books, they get to immerse themselves. I think it's I also said there is a decolonial dimension. Karl Polanyi, the historian, he was teaching a lecture at the university, and the concept of the digness was developed when working with minor workers. Thompson also found some stories about Robin Hood and thieves from the 18th century, and was lecturing about this outside the university. I'm an anthropologist myself, and we do have an instrument we use. This is very interesting. We actually think, what position will the person standing in front of us take? Talking about witchcraft, for example. There are 3 levels, 3 positions you can take, and depending on this, you will be able to understand what the perception of the local is with regard to global society. To some extent, we do have a way of understanding this activity from within, from the inside. This is very important. You cannot gain knowledge from the exterior. This is what is problematic, and going back to neoliberalism, we are talking about the commodification of the world nowadays. On one hand, we do discover new types of activities. On the other hand, we do not work on building something durable. Discovering what is happening in a village in Romania or in a mountain area in Africa, this cannot lead to decolonialism. We live in a world of economic globalism. And every aspect of human life is turned into a commodity. Yes, I do agree with you. I don't know if I managed to render this in my speech. I'm trying to not to be a hypocrite. As I said, we build a story, but we sell that story. This is a story, the summer school in Telciu is a story that we sell. We're not only talking about youth having access to activities typical of the rural, of the urban area, theater, and so on. the mere fact that they interact with another type of world, as I said, they see us, they see others, not necessarily me because I come from the village, but they see us people from the city. The school gives them the opportunity to get to know them better, and this is how some prejudice disappears, stereotypes disintegrate. In the last period, we tried to find other relevant topics of discussion. Decolonialism offers some useful but limited tools.
I would like to underline again what you said about interaction. It is not completely decolonializing, but in fact this interaction busts the myth of the urban areas. When you meet a city dweller, you realize that's just a normal person, right? Yes, indeed. And we can also say that this sort of interaction helps with the self-esteem of villagers. They become proud of who they are. We were talking about complexes related to housing. Many people in Delciu have refurbished or have made bathrooms in their own houses. And you realize that they have invested much more they could have afforded, or much more than we have, in fact. And then you have to talk to people living in rural areas and tell them that in fact we don't have such luxurious bathrooms in the city. But that's just anecdotal. I can't say that what we do is very different from other actions. Yes, these are just anecdotal details, but as long as they are real, I think they're quite relevant within the theory or outside of it. Yes, they're relevant to the activists and the academia. Because what happens there at the summer school is more like a curiosity for the villagers. Thank you very much. Thank you, Valer. Thank you, Dana. Thank you for this discussion. I'd like to thank European Lab and Transit House and Artifati for inviting us here. And I would like to thank again Kaya Journal because they came up with this topic, with this panel. And I think their idea was a very good one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A 10-minute break, and then we have the last panel about European democracy, time to reconquest. So, waiting for you.